Thunder slammed the city, and the hospice lights died like a gasp. Mara Quinn gripped the rail as monitors wailed and said, "Not yet, stay with me." The old man's chest stilled, and a thin fear opened in her like a trapdoor. She said, "Please, not tonight," and the word "please" tasted like metal. A fire alarm shrieked, and the sprinklers held their breath, and silence arrived like a sentence. Mara said, "God, tell me I'm not damned," and she felt 12 years old again. Heat pressed at her eyelids, and she saw a corridor of fire blooming from the chapel door. She said, "If fear is holy, why does it burn me hollow?" Her phone flickered to black, then flashed hell in jagged pixels that crawled like ants. She said, "This cannot be the way," yet her knees buckled to the waxy linoleum. The cross in the hallway strobed in the storm light, casting bars across her face like a cell. She said, "If you're there, speak to me as a friend, or silence me forever." For a breath, she felt a soft, impossible nearness, like warm water over ice. A clear thought rose that was not hers, and said, "Fear is not your teacher." She exhaled raggedly and said, "Then what is?" And a nurse shouted her name like a rope. Mara stood, dizzy, the vision flickering to smoke, and rain began to drum like mercy. Mara Quinn walked the corridor with a paper cup shaking, and the storm gnawed at the roof. She said, "I am 33 and still afraid of the dark inside me." She remembered a church basement where a man drew flames on a poster while kids ate cookies. She said, "He told us love meant never failing God," and the word love felt like a test. Her mother's hands had trembled at the sink, and her father kept the TV loud during altar calls. She said, "I started counting my sins like beads, and nights became ledgers she could never balance." She learned to perform goodness like a spotless uniform, and fear became the tailor. She said, "If I keep everyone alive, maybe I get a pass," and the thought curdled her stomach. The old man's last breath replayed in her body, stubborn as a bruise that would not fade. She said, "What if fear is making me smaller than the mercy I am supposed to carry?" A paramedic named Luis tried a joke at the nurse's station, and she could not lift a smile. She said, "I want faith that helps me love, not faith that cages me." The chapel door stood ajar, and the dark inside felt less like threat and more like unfinished music. She said, "If you are gentle, meet me where I am brittle," and she folded the cup like a prayer. Morning bruised the clouds, and Mara sat in her car with the vents hissing like whispers. She said, "I dreamed I was a hallway of doors, and every door led to fire." A voicemail waited from the patient's daughter, brittle with grief and bright with blame. She said, "You should have done more," and the words found every soft part of Mara. Her fingers shook on the steering wheel, and she rehearsed apologies that did not reach the bone. She said, "Fear makes me hoard sorrow and call it duty." A flyer for a grief group lay on the passenger seat, its ink damp from last night's rain. She said, "I have to go in anyway," and the car beeped because she had not fastened her belt. The storm had scrubbed the city clean, but the air still tasted like copper and thunder. She said, "If hell is a place, I have been living there politely for years." A memory pushed in, her child self kneeling on cheap carpet, waiting for a feeling that never came. She said, "What if the feeling was never the point?" and the thought startled her into stillness. She gathered her badge, rubbed the ache between her eyes, and stepped into the humming day. The chapel smelled of wax and damp wood, and a thin rain needled the stained glass. Father Thomas Reed lifted a candle snuffer and glanced at Mara with old, kind eyes. She said, "I think God wants me scared so I behave," and the words felt practiced. He said, "Fear can keep a child from traffic, but it cannot teach them to drive." She laughed without joy and said, "I am a grown woman who still hugs the curb." He sat, and the bench sighed, and he did not hurry her with fixes. She said, "Last night I saw a corridor of fire, and the confession rattled like cutlery." He said, "Visions know our language, and yours is urgency and guilt." She pressed her palms together and said, "If I let fear go, what stops me from falling apart?" He said, Love holds not fear, and his voice carried the gentleness of a scar. She watched a drop race the glass and said, "That sounds easy when your soul is quiet." He said, "I have not had a quiet soul in decades, but I have learned to sit with it." The rain softened, and the shadows changed shape, and she felt the tiniest slack in the rope. By afternoon the hall smelled like coffee and bleach, and tired laughter skated over the tile. Mara reviewed charts, but the numbers blurred and reassembled into verdicts. She said, "I am good, only if I am useful," and the sentence cut deeper than intended. Luis Ortega leaned on the counter and said, "You are allowed to be human on weekdays." She managed a small smile and said, "Teach me," and he slid a grief group schedule toward her. He said, "People bring their mess, and no one keeps score." And his eyes were steady. She folded the paper and said, "If I show up I might fall apart." He said, "Then fall apart near someone who can hand you water." The notion dropped into her like a key, simple and scandalous. She said, "I have been worshipping fear because it promised to keep me safe." A siren wailed outside, and the ceiling lights hummed like bees in a jar. She said, "What if safety is smaller than love?" And the room breathed with her. Her phone screen was normal again, dead ordinary, and she laughed softly at the mercy of boredom. She tucked the flyer into her pocket and stepped toward evening with her hands unclenched. The grief group met in a church basement that hummed like a refrigerator, and folding chairs formed a tired circle. Mara Quinn said, "I am 33, and terrified of hell, and it is making me cruel to myself." Dr. Eva Brooks said, "I am 45 and not your judge, only your witness." A widower rubbed his ring and said, "Fear kept me from saying goodbye." Mara Quinn said, "Fear keeps me useful, but only until I break." Dr. Eva Brooks said, "Fear is a smoke alarm, not a compass." A teenage boy wiped his nose and said, "I was told God loved me, but only if I feared him right." Mara Quinn felt the sentence land like a stone on a thin shelf. She said, "I work in hospice, and pretend I can bribe heaven with kindness." Dr. Eva Brooks said, "Kindness is not a bribe, it is what love does." The circle breathed, and paper cups crackled in uneasy hands. Mara Quinn said, "If I let fear go, what if I stop being good?" Dr. Eva Brooks said, "What if goodness is what remains when fear stops shouting?" The room was small and honest, and the ceiling tiles looked like gentle weather. A gray morning held the small funeral like a cupped hand, and the air smelled of wet grass and granite. Nora Sutton stared at the coffin and then at Mara, and her grief sharpened to a point. Nora Sutton said, "You let my father slip away while you prayed your pretty prayers." Mara Quinn said, "I did not leave him, and I did not leave you." Nora Sutton said, "He feared judgment, and you gave him a lullaby." The wind pressed the black tent, and the pastor's words drifted like ash. Mara Quinn said, "I sat with him because no one should be alone at the door." Nora Sutton said, "Fear kept him honest, and now fear is all I have left." Mara Quinn felt the sentence enter like cold smoke and sit behind her ribs. She said, "Fear took more from him than death did." The pastor intoned hope, but the word felt abandoned. Nora Sutton said, "Do not turn my father into a lesson." Mara Quinn said, "I am asking not to be turned into a monster." Leto looked patient, and a crow called like a gavel. Memory uncoiled, and Mara was 8 in a church basement that smelled like lemonade and fear. Reverend Caleb Hale drew flames on poster board and smiled like a captain warning of reefs. Reverend Caleb Hale said, "Love saves, but fear keeps you close." Mara Quinn said, "I will be close," and her small hands dug into the carpet. Her mother's mouth pinched as if holding in water, and her father stared at the exit sign like it might blink. Reverend Caleb Hale said, "Imagine a door of fire that opens when you lie." Mara Quinn said, "I will not lie, I will never blink." The kids laughed, then quieted, then watched the flames he colored in like homework. Reverend Caleb Hale said, "Who wants to be safe forever?" Mara Quinn raised her hand so high it hurt. Her mother later said, "Safety is not the same as joy," in a voice that sounded expensive. Mara Quinn said, "I will earn joy by being safe," and the bargain clicked shut. The poster curled on a tack, and the room felt smaller than a pocket. Back at the hospice, a new patient refused morphine and stared at the ceiling like it was a verdict. Mr. Beale said, "If I ease my pain, I betray my penance." Mara Quinn said, "You are not a ledger that needs harsher ink." Mr. Beale said, "I fear the gate will ask me what I dodged." Mara felt the words scrape the places she kept hidden from light. Father Thomas Reed stood by the door and let the silence work. Mara Quinn said, "If love is a physician, why does fear call itself the nurse?" Father Thomas Reed said, "Fear is loud, love is skilled." Mr. Beale said, "I want to be brave, but I do not know who I would be." Mara Quinn said, "Maybe you would be someone whose pain is finally not the point." The IV pump ticked like a soft metronome for a kinder song. Father Thomas Reed said, "Bravery sometimes begins as rest." Mr. Beale exhaled a long surrender that almost sounded like a prayer. Mara Quinn felt a thread loosen where the knot had lived. Night wrapped her apartment in a soft industrial hush, and the city glowed like a dim aquarium. Mara Quinn scrolled and found sermons that thundered certainty, and her ribs tightened like a belt. The algorithm served flames, and the comment sections hissed like valves. Mara Quinn said, "I cannot drink gasoline and call it devotion." The kettle clicked off, and the quiet rang brighter than the videos. She closed her eyes and saw the corridor again, but this time the door was not burning. Mara Quinn said, "If fear is not my teacher, then who grades me?" The room answered with an honest silence that hurt and healed at once. She called Luis Ortega and said, "Tell me something ordinary." Luis Ortega said, "I overwatered my plant, and now it leans like a drunk." She laughed, brief and clean, like rain finishing. Luis Ortega said, "You are allowed to be unfinished and still be loved." Mara Quinn said, "Then maybe I can stop being my own warden." The city hummed and the kettle steamed, and nothing judged her for sitting still. Morning light cut the conference room into obedient rectangles, and the air smelled like dry coffee and copier heat. Mara Quinn said, "Routine review sounds like a tribunal when your ribs are a courtroom." Peter Green said, "I am 47, and the hospital's risk officer, and this is standard." Dana Walsh said, "We want clarity, not villains." Luis Ortega slid into the back row and said, "I am here if you need a witness or a snack." Papers shuffled like small birds, and Mara felt the old basement sermon step on her lungs. She said, "If I was present at the end, that is not a crime." Peter Green said, "It is a detail, and details matter." She pictured the corridor of fire and her name stapled to the door like a warning. She said, "Fear's telling me to confess to existing." Dana Walsh said, "Fear is loud, but our forms are boring on purpose." The room softened a degree, as if the walls believed her. Mara Quinn said, "Then let the record show I stayed. I listened. I did not run." Luis Ortega tapped the table twice like a drumbeat for courage. The meeting adjourned, and her dread did not vanish, but it stopped pretending to be God. That evening the revival tent glowed like a lantern stranded in a parking lot, and wet gravel glimmered under floodlights. Reverend Caleb Hale said, "Love without fear is a door without hinges," and the crowd roared like weather. Mara Quinn said, "I was built like a door that slams." Luis Ortega said, "I am 36 and allergic to thunder that calls itself wisdom." A choir hammered joy into a key that felt one note, sharp. Reverend Caleb Hale said, "Hell is a mercy for those who refuse mercy," and the sentence bent the air. Mara Quinn felt her child self reach for the ceiling with thin hands. She said, "If fear is holy, why does it make me smaller than honesty?" A woman near the front sobbed like a metronome for repentance. Luis Ortega said, "We can walk out, and God will not trip us." Reverend Caleb Hale locked eyes with the back row and smiled like a locksmith. Mara Quinn said, "I am leaving the room where fear keeps my coat," and she stepped into the night. The tense roar diminished behind her like a stadium after the score. The night shift wore its quiet like a badge, and machines murmured the syllables of endurance. Mr. Beale grimaced and said, "Pain proves I am paying what I owe." Mara Quinn said, "You are not a debtor, you are beloved and tired." Father Thomas Reed stood near the window and said, "I am 58 and have never seen fear heal a body." Mr. Beale said, "I was told softness invites ruin." Mara felt the old sermon tug at her like an undertow. She said, "Softness can also be skill," and paged the physician with hands that steadied as they moved. The doctor arrived and said, "We can ease this with care," and the room's edges released. Mr. Beale said, "If mercy meets me first, will judgment be offended?" Father Thomas Reed said, "Mercy outranks punishment in every language I know." Mara Quinn said, "I will stay until the medicine remembers your name." The pump clicked into a gentler rhythm, and Mr. Beale's breath unknotted. She felt the corridor flare once, then dim, as if it had heard a better story. The clock hummed, and nobody apologized for the relief. In the corridor, grief walked like a person, and its shoes squeaked. Nora Sutton said, "You keep turning death into a kindness I did not consent to." Mara Quinn said, "I am not rewriting your father, I am refusing to worship your fear." Nora Sutton said, "Fear kept him faithful when joy failed him." A vending machine rattled, spitting a stubborn coil of chips back into place. Mara Quinn said, "Fear cost him comfort he had already earned." Nora Sutton said, "You talk like my uncle, and I am tired of his certainty." Mara felt a pin click in the heart's hinge at the word uncle. She said, "Your uncle is Reverend Hale." Nora Sutton said, "He baptized me with a lecture." Father Thomas Reed stepped from a doorway and said, "I am not here to arbitrate, only to listen." Nora Sutton's face broke like thawing ice, sudden and noisy. Mara Quinn said, "I will not win, and I do not need to," and she held silence like a blanket. The hallway lights hummed, and fear finally blinked first. At home, the radiator clicked like a modest metronome for healing, and the city wore its neon lightly. Mara Quinn pulled a cookbook from a high shelf, and a folded letter slid out like a secret choosing daylight. Her mother's handwriting said, "I am 35 and done paying devotion in fear." Mara Quinn said, "You were younger than I am now." The letter said, "Joy is not earned, it is welcomed, and fear is a poor doorman." She pressed the paper to her sternum, as if it could tune her bones. She said, "If love grades me, I can stop faking extra credit." Outside, a siren doppled away like a drama that refused the invitation. She texted Luis Ortega and said, "I found a way to breathe written in my mother's hand." He replied, "I will bring coffee that tastes like beginnings." She placed the letter in the visible middle of the room like a new compass. She said, "I am not throwing fear away, I am just taking its keys back." The apartment sighed, and the night did not argue. The counseling room wore its quiet like linen, and the clock ticked with polite conviction. Mara Quinn said, "I keep behaving as if dread is sacred, and mercy must apply for a permit." Dr. Eva Brooks said, "Fear is a survival script, not scripture." Mara Quinn said, "If I drop the script, who am I when the sirens stop?" Dr. Eva Brooks said, "You are a person, not a policy, and love is allowed to be inefficient." The window framed a strip of pale sky that looked like a healed scar. Mara Quinn said, "A preacher taught me that hell polices the heart and heaven rewards the frightened." Dr. Eva Brooks said, "That is compliance, not transformation, and it shrinks the soul." Mara Quinn said, "Then my piety has been dieting on punishment and calling it fruit." Dr. Eva Brooks said, "You can grieve the years fear stole, and still live the years you have." The kettle clicked, and steam ribboned the air like a minor key. Mara Quinn said, "I will not be the jailer and the prisoner. Dr. Eva Brooks said, "Good. Now practice it where it counts, with the living and the die." The clock kept time, but Mara felt a different rhythm begin. By noon the nurse's station hummed like a hive, and a radio sermon bled tinfoil thunder from someone's phone. Reverend Caleb Hale said, "Mercy without fear is counterfeit," and the words scratched the walls like wire. Luis Ortega said, "Mute that parade of sirens pretending to be wisdom." Mara Quinn said, "He keeps drafting my conscience into his army." An email pinged with Nora Sutton's complaint copied to leadership, sharp as glass, in an envelope. Mara Quinn said, "I will answer with the truth, not with groveling." Dana Walsh said, "Document facts, not feelings, and let your work speak." The radio crackled again, and Mara felt childhood reach for her throat. She said, "I am not a door he can slam anymore." Luis Ortega said, "Then walk through your own doorway." She opened a blank reply and typed slowly, as if laying stones across water. Mara Quinn said, "I stayed, I cared, I comforted, and I will not apologize for mercy." The hive quieted just enough to hear her keys choose their courage. Alarm tones pecked at the corridor, and Mr. Beale groaned like a ship in chop. Mr. Beale said, "If I surrender the pain, I surrender my penance." Father Thomas Reed said, "Penance that refuses kindness is just pain in costume." Mara Quinn said, "Your worth is not measured in hurt, and I can help." He turned his face away, as if light were an accusation. Mr. Beale said, "What if God is angrier than your medicine is strong?" Father Thomas Reed said, "Then God will have to argue with mercy." Mara primed the line with hands that no longer shook for permission. Mara Quinn said, "I will sit here until your breath remembers rest." The pump clicked, the wave rose, and the tightness began to unfurl like a stubborn knot persuaded by patience. Mr. Beale said, "I can hear my name again." Mara Quinn said, "It has always been spoken in kindness." The alarm quieted, and the room expanded by a size only relief can measure. Thunder threatened a second storm, and the chapel closet breathed dust when the latch gave. Luis Ortega said, "You sure this is the right kind of treasure hunt?" Mara Quinn said, "I want to know where my visions borrow their props." A box slumped open, and the paper smell rose like old theater. She lifted a curled poster, and flames stared back with the exact childlike teeth from her memory. Mara Quinn said, "He taught here once, a fundraiser, I remember the cookies." Luis Ortega said, "So the corridor of fire had a prop closet." She laughed, shocked, and a little grief struck, and the laugh sounded like a stitch giving way. Mara Quinn said, "My fear's a set designer, not a prophet." Luis Ortega said, "Then strike the set." She rolled the poster tight and felt the world tilt a degree toward daylight. Mara Quinn said, "I will not let an old drawing choreograph my prayers." The closet closed on the past with a click that did not echo. Rain quit like a decision, and twilight lifted the city into a gentle ash blue. Nora Sutton waited near the hospital doors, a storm that had spent itself. Nora Sutton said, "My uncle says mercy mollusts justice, and I am supposed to cheer." Mara Quinn said, "Your uncle taught my fear to dress like God." Nora Sutton said, "He taught mine to keep house." The silence between them felt useful, like space saved for furniture not yet chosen. Mara Quinn said, "I found the poster he used, the fire we both still smell." Nora Sutton said, "He said it saved souls, but it stole my sleep." Mara Quinn said, "Fear can warn, but it cannot welcome." Nora Sutton's shoulders lowered, the smallest surrender that still counted. Mara Quinn said, "I will answer your complaint with truth, and I will sit with you when truth hurts." Nora Sutton said, "I do not forgive you, but I do not want to hate you." Mara Quinn said, "That is already a kind of mercy." The doors sighed open, and twilight held them without choosing sides. Morning broke clean, and the hospice smelled like antiseptic hope. Mara Quinn said, "Today, I will not let fear draft my hands into old wars." Dana Walsh said, We have a family meeting at 10, and they want answers, not thunder. Luis Ortega said, I brought coffee that thinks kindly of you. Mara Quinn said, kindness is the only caffeine I trust. A new email arrived from Nora Sutton, and it did not bite. Nora Sutton said, I still hurt, but your notes were honest. Mara Quinn felt the corridor in her chest swap flames for daylight. She said, honesty is heavier than apology, and it lands where it helps. Father Thomas Reed stepped from the elevator and said, I will be nearby if Mercy needs a translator. Mara Quinn said, Mercy speaks patient today. The monitors kept a modest rhythm, and Fear tried to harmonize in a lower key. She said, I hear you, but you do not get the solo. The clock pointed to 10 like a finger that blesses instead of scolds. She squared her shoulders and chose the brighter hallway. The family meeting began with tight smiles that could not hold. Nora Sutton said, I am not here to absolve or accuse, just to know. Mara Quinn said, here is the chart, and here is the truth, and here is where I stayed. Peter Green said, the documentation is clear. A cousin said, our pastor says comfort is dangerous. Father Thomas Reed said, comfort is not corruption, it is care. Nora Sutton said, my uncle can make thunder sound like mathematics. Mara Quinn said, he taught many of us to mistake noise for integrity. The cousin's jaw worked like a lock, resisting the right key. Dana Walsh said, our standard is relief when possible. Nora Sutton said, my father feared hell and then feared dying, and both felt lonely. Mara Quinn said, we did not make him choose fear to feel faithful. The cousin said nothing and looked away, small and honest. Nora Sutton said, thank you for not making me pick a villain. The meeting ended with no applause and a measure of peace that felt almost professional. Afterward, the chapel felt like a lung that had learned to breathe with less noise. Father Thomas Reed said, I knew Reverend Hale when we were both young and very certain. Mara Quinn said, you carried his posters? Father Thomas Reed said, for a season, yes, until certainty starved my compassion. Mara Quinn said, why did you leave the choir of thunder? He said, I watched a boy confess to lying about a cookie with terror big enough for murder. Mara Quinn said, I was that child, in another town with the same handwriting on the poster. He said, I have spent decades learning a gentler grammar. She touched the rolled poster she had taken from the closet and felt its pulp confess. Mara Quinn said, then our corridor is a hallway we both built and can now light differently. He smiled as if granted parole from his own museum. He said, let us retire the prop and keep the lesson. She said, the lesson is mercy refuses costumes. The stained glass made puddles of color that behaved like blessings. An afternoon fire drill turned the halls into practice panic, and strobe stitched red onto everything. Mara Quinn said, here comes the corridor. The alarm insisted like a memory that had paid for front row seats. She walked toward the chapel, not away, and the air tasted like last night's thunder reheated. Luis Ortega said, I am beside you, not behind you. She nodded and let the light stripe her face without naming it a verdict. Mara Quinn said, I can feel my body reaching for the kneel like a reflex. Father Thomas Reed said, reflex is not reverence. She stepped into the chapel doorway and pictured a door not burning but opening to ordinary daylight. Mara Quinn said, I choose the door where honesty waits with water. The alarm cut, and the red bled back into ordinary beige. Luis Ortega said, you just walked past the prop. She said, I walked into my job. The silence afterward had the exact size of a new room. That night, the grief group circled again, and the chairs no longer looked like penalties. Dr. Eva Brooks said, report from the field of your own heart. Mara Quinn said, I faced a drill and found a door that was not on fire. A widower said, I threw away the alarm clock that shamed me for waking late. The teenage boy said, I told my mom I am tired of repenting for existing. Dr. Eva Brooks said, fear can warn, Love can welcome, and wisdom decides which is needed. Mara Quinn said, I have lived as if holiness were a hedge against being hurt, but it became a hedge against being loved. The room breathed like a tide that got the message. Luis Ortega said, I am learning to water my plant on purpose. Laughter arrived without asking for permission slips. Mara Quinn said, I will keep watch at the beds where endings happen, and I will not sell mercy to buy safety. Dr. Eva Brooks said, that is a vow worth practice. The fluorescent buzz softened, and someone refilled the cups without ceremony. The ICU hummed with beeps and sterile air. Mara Quinn said, every alarm sounds like the sermons I grew up with. Luis Ortega said, then let's rewrite the verses. In room 12, Mr. Beale gasped, fear sharp in his eyes. Mara Quinn said, you're not at a fiery door, you're here with me. The respiratory therapist said, airway support now. Father Thomas Reed appeared at the doorway, silent but grounding. Mara's hands moved steady, not fierce. The monitor's frantic rhythm slowed into something almost calm. Luis Ortega said, that's a better hymn. Mr. Beale whispered, I can hear my name. Mara Quinn said, good, it's not the call you dread. The room breathed again. Afterward, in the supply closet, Mara said, I almost let fear choose my hands. Luis Ortega said, you didn't. She leaned into shelves smelling of detergent. A memory of Reverend Hale's mask lesson flickered. Mara said, even props can wound. Luis Ortega said, then you've been disarming them all night. She almost smiled. In the chapel, Father Thomas Reed said, your corridor is a story fear keeps retelling. Mara Quinn said, then I'll edit the ending. Stained glass spilled color across their shoes. She unrolled the old flame poster, then calmly tore it in two. He said nothing, but smiled like someone hearing a door unlock. A patient's daughter paced the corridor. She said, I don't want my mother to die scared. Mara Quinn said, then we'll keep fear from the bed. Inside, she held the old woman's hand until her breath slowed. The daughter wept, but it was softer than before. At home, rain pattered against the glass. Mara texted Luis Ortega, no corridor tonight. He replied, then sleep without a guard. She set her phone aside, lights low, and let the quiet be the only voice in the room. Fear had no lines to deliver. Dawn crept through the blinds, thin and gold, and the hospice stirred like a waking tide. Mara Quinn said, today is discharge for the patient, in 4B. Luis Ortega said, she's ready to go home to her garden. In the room, sunlight touched the bed before Mara did. The woman smiled, fragile but full. Mara Quinn said, no fires here, only open doors. Father Thomas Reed stood by with a soft prayer that felt more like a thank you. The air was warm enough to make the fear stay outside. Mara Quinn said, go toward the things that let you breathe easy. The woman said, then I'll start with roses. The hall seemed wider when they left it together. The grief group met one last time before summer break, the chairs arranged in a loose spiral. Dr. Eva Brooks said, what is one fear you've laid down this season? Mara Quinn said, that hell is the only teacher worth listening to. The teenage boy said, that my worth is negotiable. The widower said, that grief makes me bad company. Luis Ortega said, that I can't keep plants alive. Laughter flowed without tripping on permission. Dr. Eva Brooks said, fear can sit in the audience now, not at the mic. Mara Quinn felt the corridor in her mind go dim like a theater after the credits. She said, I'm ready to walk outside. In the chapel, the torn flame poster lay on the altar like a relic of a religion she no longer followed. Father Thomas Reed said, you can burn it if you like. Mara Quinn said, it's already out of power. She placed it into a donation bin for paper recycling. Luis Ortega said, that's the opposite of fire, it's making something grow. The stained glass turned their faces into fragments of color. Mara Quinn said, I'm done using fear as a compass. Reed said, Then you've found another north. On her break, Mara stood outside under a pale sky, coffee warming her hands. Nora Sutton approached, no storm in her face. Nora said, "I'm not here for an argument." Mara Quinn said, "Neither am I." They stood in shared quiet while the wind moved leaves across the pavement. Nora said, "I still miss him." Mara Quinn said, "I do too." That was enough. That night, her apartment was quiet but not empty. Mara lit a single candle and set it near the window. She said aloud, "Fear is not my teacher anymore." Outside, the city breathed without judgment. She closed her eyes not to pray but to rest. The room held her without condition.